What if the biggest lie in this war is not on the battlefield, but in the word deal itself? What if what sounds like diplomacy is really a struggle over oil, power, fear, and political survival? And what if, behind the headlines, no one in this crisis is actually trying to end the fire, only to control how it burns? Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and support our work. That support helps us keep producing sharp, honest analysis on the political and economic forces reshaping the world. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. So let's get straight to the real question: can Donald Trump do a deal with Iran? On the surface, that sounds like a narrow diplomatic question. In reality, it is a test of power under pressure. It is a test of who still has leverage, who is bluffing, who is trapped by their own rhetoric, and who can still shape the outcome of a war that is already bigger than any single front. Trump says there have been productive contacts. Iran says that is fake news. Israel keeps striking. Iran keeps firing back. Gulf allies remain exposed. Oil traders are watching every word. Airlines are cutting routes. Governments are trying to calm their citizens while preparing for deeper instability. That is the first truth people need to understand: when war reaches this level, language itself becomes part of the conflict. Statements are not just statements. They are signals to markets, warnings to rivals, reassurance for allies, and political theater for domestic audiences. That is why the word deal is so dangerous, and so misleading. A deal, in the classic sense, suggests two sides are moving toward compromise. But that is not what this moment looks like. This moment looks like coercion wrapped in diplomacy. It looks like military pressure being converted into bargaining leverage. It looks like every side trying to avoid the price of total escalation without admitting that the price is becoming too high to pay. And that takes us to the deeper structure of this crisis. Trump may want the image of a deal because deals project control. They suggest that force has produced results, that pressure worked, that chaos has been turned into leverage. Iran, by contrast, cannot afford to look like it is negotiating from weakness, because the Islamic Republic survives not only through force, but through perception, the perception that it resists, absorbs, and does not bow. Israel has yet another logic. It wants military momentum preserved, not interrupted too early by diplomacy that may leave core threats still standing. So already, the idea of one clean agreement begins to collapse. These actors are not moving toward the same finish line. And for Americans, none of this is distant. This is not just about missiles over Tel Aviv or Tehran. This is about gasoline, inflation, military risk, and the economic pressure that follows every major Middle East shock. Once the Strait of Hormuz enters the equation, every household in America is closer to this crisis than it thinks. That is how power works in the modern world. A threat near an oil corridor becomes pain at the pump. A strike on infrastructure becomes higher transport costs. A regional war becomes domestic anxiety. So when we ask whether Trump can do a deal with Iran, we are really asking something much bigger: can the United States still turn raw pressure into stable political outcomes, or has the system become so fractured, so financialized, and so militarized that everyone now knows how to escalate, but no one truly knows how to stop? That is the question behind the crisis. And that is why the story is only beginning. Trump's pivot, from threats to talks without admitting weakness. Donald Trump's pivot from threats to talks is not a sign of confusion. It is a sign of pressure. The mistake many people make is assuming that when a leader changes tone, he has changed goals. That is not always true. Sometimes the goal stays the same, and only the method changes because reality starts pushing back. That is what this moment looks like. Trump began by speaking the language he trusts most: force, dominance, punishment, spectacle. He threatened Iran's energy infrastructure because he understands that in a modern conflict, energy is not just a resource. It is a pressure point. It is state revenue, market confidence, regime stability, and global fear all rolled into one. To threaten energy is to threaten the nervous system of a country and, at the same time, the nervous system of the world economy. That kind of threat was designed to do more than intimidate Iran. It was meant to tell Israel that Washington was still committed, tell U.S. voters that strength was on display, and tell markets that America still intended to control the board. But then came the pause. Then came the softer language. Then came the suggestion of productive contact. That shift matters, because it reveals where power meets cost. Trump is not backing away because he suddenly discovered moderation. He is adjusting because full escalation carries a price that even a White House built on bold rhetoric cannot casually absorb. A direct and sustained assault on Iranian energy infrastructure would not stay contained inside military logic. It would move straight into financial logic. Oil would react. Shipping would react. Insurance markets would react. Airlines would react. Inflation expectations would react. And once inflation expectations move, politics moves with them. This is the part many cable news conversations miss. Presidents do not operate only inside military timelines. They operate inside price systems. They operate inside bond markets, consumer anxiety, business confidence, and the hard political reality that the American public will tolerate strategic risk much longer in theory than it will tolerate economic pain in daily life. Trump knows that. He knows that strength is easy to sell until strength starts showing up in gas stations, grocery aisles, and airline tickets. So his pivot is best understood as an attempt to preserve leverage without paying the full price of the next step. He wants the threat to remain alive, because the threat itself is bargaining capital. But he also wants room to slow the clock, test whether pressure can be translated into an outcome, and avoid being trapped by his own escalation ladder. That is the real genius and danger of his style. Trump often acts as though unpredictability is strategy. Sometimes it works because opponents hesitate. Sometimes it fails because allies hesitate too. And that is the deeper issue here. A pivot like this only works if all sides believe there is still a line between coercion and chaos. If Iran believes Trump is bluffing, the pressure weakens. If Israel believes Trump is slowing down too early, alliance friction grows. If markets believe the rhetoric has detached from the battlefield, the calming effect disappears fast. That is why this moment is so fragile. Trump is trying to speak in two directions at once, toward war and toward negotiation, toward force and toward restraint, toward domestic applause and international caution. That can buy time. It can even create temporary advantage. But it is not the same as control. And in a crisis like this, the distance between buying time and losing control can become very small, very quickly. Iran's position: why Tehran says fake news and still leaves the door open. Tehran's answer to Donald Trump tells us something essential about how this war is really being fought. When Iran dismisses talk of negotiations as fake news, it is not simply denying a meeting, a message, or a back channel. It is defending a political position. It is protecting an image. And in the Islamic Republic, image is not cosmetic. It is part of the regime's survival system. That is the first point Americans need to understand. Iran does not speak the way Western governments speak, because it is not managing the same political structure. In Washington, leaders often use diplomacy as public theater. In Tehran, public language is a form of internal control. It tells the elite, the security apparatus, the clerical establishment, the broader public, and regional allies whether the state still looks firm. If the Islamic Republic appears to negotiate too openly under military pressure, it risks sending the one signal it can least afford to send: that force works, that pressure is breaking the system, that resistance has limits visible to everyone. So when Tehran says Trump's claims are false, it is doing more than rejecting his narrative. It is refusing to let him define the terms of the confrontation. That matters, because Trump's language is built around ownership. He wants to project that he moved events, that he created leverage, that he forced a strategic opening. Iran cannot publicly validate that story without weakening itself. For Tehran, the optics of negotiation are almost as important as the terms. A government under fire can explore channels quietly. It can test signals. It can listen. But it cannot appear to bow on command. And yet this is where the picture becomes more complex. Public denial does not mean strategic closure. In fact, states under this level of pressure often do the opposite of what they say in public. They deny, delay, harden their language, and still leave space for indirect communication. Not because they trust the other side, but because they need information. They need to know where the red lines are, how serious the threats are, whether the other side is bluffing, and what price might be required to prevent the next stage of escalation. That is why Islamabad matters. That is why indirect channels matter. In this kind of crisis, diplomacy rarely begins with ceremony. It begins with deniability. The deeper logic of Iran's position is regime survival. Not victory in some romantic sense. Not ideological purity for its own sake. Survival. The Islamic Republic needs to avoid strategic humiliation, avoid the appearance of surrender, preserve some deterrent capacity, and maintain enough cohesion to keep the system intact under war stress. That means Tehran must perform strength even while calculating risk. It must sound unbending even while measuring its limits. It must show that it can still impose costs, because any actor that can still impose costs cannot be treated as politically defeated. This is why the missile question matters so much. Even if Iran has lost a significant share of its stockpile, even if its options are narrower than they were weeks ago, it still has enough reach to prove that the war remains expensive. That remaining capacity is not just military. It is political leverage. It tells Washington, Israel, and the Gulf that Iran may be bruised, but it is not irrelevant. It can still disturb markets. It can still threaten security calculations. It can still shape the conversation. So Tehran's message is disciplined, cold, and strategic. It is saying, we may hear your signals, but we will not legitimize your narrative. We may leave a door open, but we will not walk through it as a defeated power. And that distinction matters, because in wars like this, the first side that loses control of the narrative often loses bargaining power right after. Israel's dilemma: a military edge without full control of the endgame. Israel's deepest problem in this war is not whether it can strike hard. It can. It has. The deeper problem is whether military superiority can be translated into political control over how this conflict ends. That is where the illusion begins to crack. Because in modern war, especially in the Middle East, destroying targets is not the same as controlling the final outcome. And right now, that gap is becoming impossible to ignore. For months, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Israeli security establishment framed the confrontation with Iran in historic terms. This was not sold to the Israeli public as a limited exchange, not as a contained operation, and not as a narrow act of deterrence. It was framed as something much bigger, a turning point, a strategic opening, a chance to break the structure of threat that has defined Israel's long-term security doctrine. That framing created political momentum, but it also created a trap. Once a war is sold as transformative, anything short of transformation begins to look incomplete. That is why the idea of Donald Trump moving towards some kind of understanding with Tehran creates such deep unease inside Israel. The issue is not only trust. The issue is ownership. Israel can degrade military assets. Israel can widen pressure on Iran and Lebanon. Israel can impose extraordinary costs. But if Washington reserves the right to decide when the escalation stops, then Israel may find itself in the most uncomfortable position of all, operationally central, but strategically subordinate. That is a hard reality for any state to accept, especially one that believes it has carried the frontline burden of the conflict. This is where alliance politics becomes brutally clear. Israel and the United States are aligned, but they are not identical. Israel lives inside the geography of threat. The United States lives inside the architecture of power. Those are not the same thing. Israel measures time in missile ranges, border exposure, and deterrence failures. Washington measures time in oil shocks, military overstretch, alliance costs, domestic politics, and global risk management. So even when both sides use the language of shared interest, their threshold for enough can diverge sharply. That divergence now matters more than ever. If Trump believes military gains can be converted into a diplomatic arrangement that lowers systemic risk, he may see value in pausing before Israel believes the strategic job is done. For Netanyahu, that is dangerous terrain. Because once diplomacy enters the frame, the question is no longer only what Israel has destroyed. The question becomes what Israel has actually secured. And those are not the same thing. Military action can weaken an adversary. It does not automatically remove the political conditions that recreate the threat. The pressure is even sharper because Israel is not fighting on one front alone. Its expanding posture in southern Lebanon, especially around the Litani River, shows that this is not only about containing Hezbollah fire. It is about shaping territory, movement, infrastructure, and return. That tells us something important about Israeli strategy at this stage. Israel is not just trying to win exchanges. It is trying to lock in facts on the ground before diplomacy redraws the ceiling. In plain English, it is trying to make military reality harder for politicians to reverse later. But that strategy carries a hidden cost. The more Israel relies on force to shape the future, the more dependent it becomes on continued American tolerance. And American tolerance is never unconditional. It rises when fear rises. It falls when energy prices surge, markets shake, and political risk spreads. That means Israel may still have the edge in firepower, but not full control over the timing, scope, or political endgame of the war. And that is the core of Israel's dilemma. It can hit harder than its enemies. It cannot alone decide what victory will mean once the United States starts calculating a different kind of price. The real battlefield is also economic: oil, shipping, airlines, inflation. The missiles may dominate the headlines, but the real battlefield is also economic. In fact, that is where this war becomes most dangerous for the United States. Because once conflict in the Middle East starts pushing against oil flows, shipping routes, aviation networks, and consumer prices, it stops being a distant security story and becomes a direct test of economic resilience. This is the part of the crisis that Washington fears most, even when it does not say so plainly. Start with the Strait of Hormuz. Too many people hear that name and think of a narrow stretch of water on a map. That is a mistake. Hormuz is one of the great pressure valves of the global system. It is where military risk turns into financial shock. It is where regional escalation becomes an international tax on modern life. When threats around Hormuz rise, traders do not wait for confirmation. They reprice risk immediately. Oil climbs not only because barrels may disappear, but because uncertainty itself becomes expensive. And once uncertainty becomes expensive, every layer of the economy begins to absorb the damage. That damage moves fast. Higher oil prices do not stay inside energy markets. They flow outward through fuel, freight, food, aviation, logistics, manufacturing, and household budgets. Jet fuel shortages begin to disrupt domestic and international flight schedules. Airlines cancel, reroute, and cut capacity. Shipping costs climb as insurers charge more to cover risk. Import prices rise. Business planning weakens. Consumers pull back. Investors grow nervous. The war begins to enter daily life not through ideology, but through receipts, delays, shortages, and anxiety. That is when the public stops treating geopolitics as background noise. This is why the phrase, global energy situation is critical, carries real weight. It is not diplomatic exaggeration. It is a recognition that the world economy is still deeply exposed to choke points, and that war in one region can quickly trigger system-wide instability. Even countries far from the battlefield are already adjusting. Governments are reassuring the public, rationing supply, reducing flights, or preparing financial support. Those are not symbolic moves. They are signs that policymakers understand a very old truth: once energy disruption begins, political pressure follows close behind. For the United States, this is where foreign policy collides with domestic reality. American leaders can talk about strength, deterrence, and strategic credibility all they want. But the moment this crisis feeds sustained inflation, the political meaning changes. Voters may support toughness in theory. They do not support permanently higher living costs in practice. And energy inflation is especially punishing because it spreads through the entire economy. It raises transport costs, lifts food prices, squeezes small businesses, and weakens consumer confidence all at once. Central banks cannot solve that with elegant speeches. Interest rates do not reopen shipping lanes. Monetary policy does not stop drones. That is why markets reacted so sharply to Donald Trump's diplomatic language. They were not celebrating peace. They were reacting to the possibility that someone in Washington understood the scale of the economic threat. This is a crucial distinction. The market does not care about political theater for its own sake. It cares about duration, exposure, and whether decision-makers still have a credible path to contain systemic damage. So when we talk about whether Trump can do a deal with Iran, we are also talking about whether he can lower the economic risk premium now hanging over the global system. That is the real test. Not just whether fewer missiles fly tomorrow, but whether fear begins to come out of oil, out of shipping, out of airline schedules, and out of family budgets. Because in a crisis like this, economic pressure is not a side effect of war. It is one of the main forces pushing every player toward the next decision. Palestine in the shadows, the war behind the war. While the world watches Donald Trump, Tehran, Israel, and the oil markets, another reality is unfolding with almost unbearable clarity. Palestine is being pushed deeper into the shadows of a larger war. And that is not an accident. It is one of the oldest patterns in modern power politics. When a major regional confrontation captures the headlines, quieter forms of domination move faster, harder, and with less resistance. What happens in the dark is often just as important as what explodes in the light. In the West Bank, that darker pattern is now impossible to ignore. Settler attacks have surged. Palestinian communities have faced burned homes, torched vehicles, blocked roads, uprooted olive groves, and growing isolation. Entrances to towns have been shut. Movement has been restricted. In village after village, the message has been the same: pressure the people, fragment the land, tighten the map. This is not random disorder. It is structured pressure. It is about reshaping daily life so completely that displacement no longer looks like a single dramatic event, but like a series of suffocating facts that leave people with fewer choices, less safety, and less ground beneath them. That is why the violence matters beyond the immediate horror. It is not only physical. It is political. It changes who can move, who can harvest, who can worship, who can stay, and who slowly learns that the law may not protect them when it matters most. When roads are blocked and communities are cut off, the objective is larger than intimidation. It is territorial fragmentation. It is the making of a new reality, one checkpoint, one fire, one night raid at a time. This is how control expands in modern occupation. Not only through tanks and declarations, but through repeated pressure until exhaustion becomes a governing tool. The symbolism around Al-Aqsa cuts even deeper. Reports of Muslim worshippers being cleared from the compound during Eid, and of force used against Palestinians trying to pray outside Jerusalem's Old City, reveal something that many policymakers still refuse to name clearly. This is not only a struggle over land. It is a struggle over presence, identity, memory, and belonging. Once sacred space becomes an arena of force, the conflict is no longer just about security. It becomes a contest over who is allowed to exist publicly, spiritually, and nationally in full view of power. And then there is Gaza, where suffering has become so constant that the world risks treating it as background. Aid has dropped. Prices have risen. Hospitals are under pressure. Fuel, medicine, and basic supplies remain fragile. Reconstruction is stalled. The so-called ceasefire has not delivered real safety. It has delivered a thinner, quieter form of instability, one in which people remain trapped between scarcity and renewed violence. That kind of crisis is politically dangerous precisely because it does not always produce dramatic images every day. Instead, it produces slow deterioration, silent fear, and a society pushed closer to collapse by attrition. For the United States, this should not be treated as a separate moral file disconnected from the strategic conversation with Iran. That would be a profound mistake. Because any regional arrangement that cools one axis of conflict while allowing another system of dispossession to deepen is not real stability. It is selective stabilization. And selective stabilization always carries a future cost. It stores anger. It stores trauma. It stores the conditions for the next eruption. That is the war behind the war. While leaders talk about deterrence, diplomacy, and strategic balance, Palestinians are living through the grinding reality of power exercised without pause. And if Washington believes it can help manage the Iran crisis while ignoring what is accelerating in the West Bank and Gaza, then it is not solving the region's disorder. It is merely choosing which pain counts now and which pain will return later, angrier, deeper, and far harder to contain. Can Trump actually do the deal? Conditions, obstacles, and the strategic forecast. Now we come to the hardest question of all. Not whether Donald Trump wants a deal with Iran. Not whether he can announce one. Not whether headlines can be shaped to make one appear real for 48 hours. The real question is whether he can build an arrangement strong enough to survive the forces already tearing this region apart. And that is where the answer becomes uncomfortable. Yes, Trump can probably produce some form of deal. But Americans need to be precise about what that means. He may be able to create a pause, open an indirect channel, or push all sides into a narrow transactional understanding. He may be able to claim that pressure worked, that Tehran blinked, that Washington restored leverage. But a true strategic settlement is something very different. A true settlement would require not just movement in public language, but a change in incentives across the entire structure of the conflict. And right now, those incentives are still pushing toward managed confrontation, not durable peace. For Trump to get even a limited deal, several conditions have to line up at the same time. Tehran has to believe that continued escalation threatens the Islamic Republic more than a carefully framed compromise does. But it also has to preserve enough dignity to avoid looking broken at home. That means any arrangement would need ambiguity. Not clarity. Ambiguity is often what keeps these deals alive. Trump would have to present strength to the American public while quietly allowing enough political space for Tehran to step back without calling it surrender. That is difficult, but not impossible. The next condition is Israel. This may be the most sensitive variable in the entire equation. If Benjamin Netanyahu believes a pause comes too early, before Israeli objectives have been secured, then friction inside the U.S.-Israel alliance could rise fast. Israel may not be able to veto American diplomacy outright, but it can complicate the environment around it. It can raise the military tempo, widen adjacent fronts, or intensify the argument that premature restraint only guarantees a more dangerous war later. That means Trump is not negotiating only with Iran. He is also negotiating with the strategic impatience of his own closest regional partner. Then there is the market itself, which in a crisis like this behaves almost like a political actor. Oil, shipping, insurance, aviation, and capital flows are not passive background conditions. They create pressure. They narrow options. They punish delay. If energy instability keeps spreading, every leader in this crisis becomes more exposed. That is one reason a limited deal remains possible. The system itself is telling the major players that escalation carries rising financial costs. But here is the warning: systems can pressure leaders toward restraint, and still fail to produce trust. That is how you get temporary calm without real resolution. So what is the most likely outcome? Not peace. Not total war. The most likely outcome is managed instability sold as progress. A temporary cooling. A partial understanding. A narrow arrangement that reduces risk at the top while leaving the deeper architecture of conflict intact below. Trump could call that a deal. Tehran could call it proof of resistance. Israel could continue shaping the battlefield elsewhere. Markets could rally for a moment. But none of that would mean the underlying struggle had been solved. That is the strategic forecast Americans should keep in mind. Watch oil prices. Watch Israeli military tempo. Watch whether Tehran's language hardens or becomes more selective. Watch Islamabad and other indirect channels. Watch whether the White House shifts from threats to claims of achievement. Above all, watch whether the next agreement changes the structure of the crisis, or simply delays its next explosion. Because that is the final truth here. Trump may be able to do a deal with Iran. But the deal that is possible is likely smaller, narrower, and more fragile than the one he wants to sell. And if the root system of fear, force, and regional imbalance remains in place, then what looks like a breakthrough may turn out to be little more than an intermission before the next fire. In the end, this story is not only about Donald Trump, Iran, Benjamin Netanyahu, or even the shifting language of Washington and Tehran. It is about how power really works when the world is under stress. Trump wants to show that pressure can produce results. Tehran wants to prove that resistance still has value. Israel wants to make sure military momentum is not traded away too early. And behind all of them sits the larger system: oil markets, shipping lanes, inflation, public fear, alliance politics, and the daily cost carried by ordinary people who never chose this fight. That is what makes this story so powerful. Every leader in it is trying to look strong, but every leader is also trapped by something bigger than pride. Trump is trapped by economic pressure and the limits of spectacle. Tehran is trapped by the survival logic of the Islamic Republic. Benjamin Netanyahu is trapped by the gap between military success and political closure. And the region itself is trapped inside a cycle where force creates leverage, but rarely creates peace. That may be the hardest truth of all. In modern politics, the most dangerous crises are not the ones where nobody has power. They are the ones where every player has enough power to damage the system, but not enough wisdom to stabilize it. And that lesson reaches far beyond war. In our own lives, we often confuse pressure with control, noise with strength, and short-term advantage with real victory. But real leadership, whether in politics, business, family, or personal struggle, is not just about forcing outcomes. It is about knowing when escalation becomes self-destruction, when pride becomes a prison, and when a pause is not weakness but strategic intelligence. That is the lesson to carry into daily life. Do not measure strength only by how hard you can push. Measure it by whether your choices create stability, trust, and a future you can actually live in. Now here's a quick question for you. Do you believe Donald Trump can produce a real deal with Iran? A. Yes, because pressure can still force a limited but meaningful agreement. B. No, because the conflict is too deep and any deal would only delay the next crisis. Comment A or B below. And what do you think overall? Is this crisis moving toward a real diplomatic breakthrough, or just a temporary pause before a bigger explosion? Share your view in the comments so everyone can read and compare perspectives. And subscribe to the channel to support our work and help keep these deep political and economic breakdowns coming.